I learned in I said it's nearly 20 years ago to conferences. Put a title that promises everything. I'll leave you to solve. I'm going to deliver. I am still for myself so much in the question space on this. I've asked Tracy to keep us to 20 minutes talking. So I really value your input. And it's for me quite interesting in this building today. I know you think the place is full of law, but this will always be for me the school of education. Where I did my HCE here in 1991, it was an extremely significant part of my education, my youth part of my education. And I will tell you in a moment what got me to ask this question, but I have to say I did a lot of this work in January back this year, and the more I worked it, the more distressed I got, because I got to the point to say, you should have sorted this out in 1991. Like maybe you weren't listening in that lecture. But I guess what I'm saying is the questions that I think are really important do not have simple answers, and my proposal to you today is that we have to think differently about this very fundamental question. So I have written an article based on this talk. I'm very happy to share it with you. It's under review somewhere presently. I'm sure it's going to get a good shredding. So feel free to send me your shredding as well. I'm committed really that we can find good ways of thinking. That's my thing. So this is my starting point, and I think it's your starting point today as well. And I'm enormously grateful to Jenni Case and colleagues. We did a national study that drew our attention to how the higher education system looks in South Africa. You want to come in? I mean, there's no answers. Any questions? You want answers? Sorry, guys. You know what we also have to say? How to balance the teaching and learning concepts. Jenni's not good enough, even with us moving to a bigger venue. So it's about the state of teaching and learning GCT, I think, is healthy. So just sorry, while people are coming in, and this is stuff that we know, but I just want to say what this means for me as a starting point. So this is about our higher education system. You all know these figures. It's about participation, and then this is about history. And I've sat along with this report, and even with more detailed data that comes from the engineering. Long and short, and I've had very robust discussions with the instructor colleagues around it. There are low participation and low success. Small sectors of South African youngsters get into higher education, and even then, you may assume it flies. The rest of Africa has very low participation, 2%, but everybody basically passes. We're in this weird state. And the reason I'm really grateful for this, we had a lot of debates around at this university. I really grappled with it. There was a particular proposal here, let's make all degrees 1 year longer. In my own work, I didn't feel that was the solution, but what it really got me to do was to think. And there's a range of pieces that I've been working on this year. This is one of them, which was a set of questions that I felt we needed to go deeper at in order to come up with a kind of the practical route forward, because that's what we have to do. So it's not only about pontificating, it's about trying to figure out what to do. At the same time, we've had lots of discussions about online stuff, and I know it's also been something I've really struggled with. And we work with a very expensive model of teaching here at UCT, and I'm really being very challenged to talk about how that teaching relates to student learning, knowing that it's so expensive, and in the context of some other potential models, thinking about that. So, moving on then, teaching and learning. It's somewhere around about the mid-90s that this really started being everywhere. We have centers, we have, but only just started, we must maybe actually just say, I wrote in the paper, I think it's better than my talk. Otherwise it's just going to not really go. Okay, so in a way, I gave you my backdrop. The question still bothers me after all this time, and philosophical discussions about university and about students in South Africa. So teaching and learning is everywhere. I don't suppose it. In fact, it's so lovely to have your teaching and learning here as well. We have centers, we have scholarships of teaching and learning, we have cars focused on teaching and learning. Your own Google. Comes to something like this. So you would think we've got this thing totally penned out, how these two relate to each other. Oh, this is learning and teaching, which is apparently a more progressive way of doing it. Now there's a paper that I've been quite attracted to in my own deliberations by Edwards, coming from a discourse analysis, postmodern angle on things, where he's opened this up more eloquently than I think I can. And he starts his article, I'll read this to you. I find myself intrigued by the and in teaching and learning. How the two become conjoined in this way? What type of link is being suggested? What purpose is in effect? Why and rather than another conjunction? In other words, what theoretically is implied? How does the and glue concepts such as teaching and learning together? And I recommend you, from this point, Edwards takes us down a journey using, I think, pieces of post-structuralism, discourse analysis, and does a very playful thing, as only those guys can do with this topic. And I think comes to critique what this discursive mode is doing for our ways of thinking. I'm going to be much more pedestrian than that, and I can't necessarily say, oh, it's a discourse game. But I went to think about the literature that I'm quite familiar with, which is higher education literature, student learning research, and sort of asked, what are the underlying ways of thinking about teaching and learning and the relation between them that is suggested by our literature? And you know this, so if you've been through NAP, I saw Jeff somewhere, if you've been through, I mean, sure we locate you with a bit of Ramsden. I think a very powerful literature coming from the 80s in the area of higher education studies, specifically student learning. And it's given us constructs that are quite useful often for us as teachers. And this is what I've got in my work as well. So to just quickly flag to you, when we want to know what's happening in student learning, concept of approaches to learning is almost intuitive. It's one of its problems, actually. Deep learning focused on understanding, and surface learning focused on passing exams but not necessarily understanding, although about that even from my own experience. Now, Blake does something really important with his concept of constructive alignment. Because one thing to say there are different approaches to learning in a class, but you immediately start thinking, well, how can I get more of my students to use a deep approach, or even a strategic approach, but not a surface approach to learning? So that's a question that I've wrestled with a very long time as well. And Beck came up with this idea of if the teaching is aligned for particular outcomes, then you will see those outcomes in the students. It makes a lot of logical sense. Taking that further, really, Prosser, Ramsden, and Treadwell really started characterizing teaching. So they had, where we had approaches to learning, they also had conceptions of and approaches to teaching, and managed to do a lot of empirical work and essentially come up with categories, largely the two polarities of teaching approaches that seem to foster or be aimed towards deep, and teaching approaches that seem to be aimed towards surface. Again, this is a very appealing connection, and then proceeded to do large-scale, statistically based work. And they came up with a degree of a correlation between the two. And it was particularly strong, the correlation where there were teaching approaches aimed towards deep, you saw more likely to see students taking deep approaches to learning. You would kind of think, well, it's all done. We can package that piece of research away, and we can now get on with teaching properly. But I'm troubled by that. And as I say, here's Ramsden as well. I'm with them on this. Of course, this is the aim of teaching. Teaching is directed towards student learning. But how does that connection actually happen? And here I'm asking about causality. And every single one of you who are teachers here knows this is not a direct causality. And every time you mark the exam, you have this incredible distress. I do. I thought I taught it so well. And the students have put forward something that indicates their learning was not the type of learning that I anticipated. How can I more make that happen? So I suggest, for myself at least, I don't think this question is finished. I also expect that the times we live in, which are very dynamic, I think youth identity, students, are in an interesting space with a lot of possibilities, and it might also be that we need to ask this question differently. And my colleague Paul Ashwin, some of you know Ashwin's work, Lancaster, has specifically said that these frameworks that came out of work in the late 70s, early 80s, given the social changes since then, it would be surprising that they have an unmodified universality. So, moving on then, and these are my grapples then. There's quite a lot of colleagues here who've been very helpful in trying to think about what does a critical realist conception mean. Now, I'm not going to go through a whole yada yada on critical realism. If you're interested in that, there's stuff I can give you to read. I want to also pay tribute to Kevin Williams, who has really been signal to my work and willing enough to be with us today. Long and short, critical realist said just because this thing statistically correlates with this other thing, that doesn't mean there's actually an explanatory link between them. And really we need to get down to, for what explanation we need to understand entities at the level of the real. So just because something seems a common sense way of conceptualizing, it seems to sort of work at a common sense level, even your own perception of it, that may not be a theory that's going to really work to help you to investigate this as a social science. So, I mean, with quick, long, and short is, and I think this is really important, and I mean, many of you have gone on versions of these journeys. You can get stuck in the theory journey and never leave the other end, because it's quite fun as well. I mean, you can use ontology in a sentence, you feel great. But the only reason we engage theoretically is to understand the world we're looking at. And the social world is complicated in ways way beyond, well, just in very different ways to the natural world. The argument of critical realism, though, is that we can get to understand phenomena and we can build realist explanations. Here's an idea that, say, it takes from Marx's chaotic conceptions, and this is the issue, just because this correlates with this, is not necessarily an explanation. Now, building on Kevin's work, I've been very attracted from a while. Kevin put this challenge out. And initially I didn't really understand his challenge. In this article published in the Journal of Critical Realism, he said learning needs to be extracted from a vice-like linkage to teaching. And I hope that disturbs you a bit. It did me initially, because I really believe in my teaching. But in this teaching and learning, always together, we are actually, to some degree, evading the realities both of teaching and of learning. As of teaching is a distinct activity, learning is a distinct activity. Teachers, distinct learners, with actually different objectives, those activities, intimately connected. And William's really talking to learning. To do this, learning has to be understood on its own as an agential activity with structural consequences. Now, we're not surprised that learning can happen without teaching. And this is one of my struggles with some things in the online space are a bit simplistic. We shouldn't be surprised if people can go online and learn a whole lot. It's fantastic. This is the printing press. You picked up a book and learn something. But teaching purports to make that learning possible in different ways. And it also brings a group of people together. That's why it's a different phenomenon. And what, in thinking things through as a critical realist, one crucial thing I'm still grappling with this is that reality is stratified. And maybe this is very interesting to link to the previous presentation, because there's a lot of useful work in neuroscience. It doesn't translate totally directly into classroom. There are layers of emergence, layers at which we operate. Neuroscience, individual brain, connection in the class, connection in society. A lot of people were given us as layers. Critical realists would say that what we need to think of, though, is that the properties that emerge from a lower stratum are not just the sum of the things that are below them. And this is what it means for me in terms of teaching and learning. And this is scribbling diagram. There's the strata, there's teaching, there's learning. Straight. They distinct. The relationship between them, I want to argue, operates at a different stratum. It emerges from these distinct activities. And here, I'm taking an idea Paul Ashwin put forward, and I'm using it in a different direction. He talked about a teaching-learning interaction, which I struggled with when I first read that. What does it say? This is not just merely either teaching or learning or just the sum of them. Now, a very useful illustration from Margaret Archer's work on this to explain emergence. And anyone who's in either family, partnership, of marriage, whatever, you will know that there's me, there's my partner, and there's our marriage or our relationship. It's actually distinct from just being a sum of the turbines. And it has its own causal properties. The relationship has its own real identity. Obviously, there's a lot in it. It is emergent from both of our activities and orientations. But it comes to have its own real existence. So now, I'm wanting to think about this teaching and learning, the teaching-learning interaction. And to go further with more of Ashwin's work, which really I found very useful. Ashwin says, to understand what happened within a particular teaching-learning interaction, we need to understand how the interaction was shaped by processes that might not be visible in the interaction. And this is our challenge, and this is why South Africa 2014 is such an interesting, very challenging place to do university education. Part is we have stories. So then from this, just a very quick flag to morphogenetic theory, which I'm not going to explain today, but the long and the short of this thing, we're understanding social life, and I put education fundamentally in here, is that interaction is at the heart of change, of agents, of structure, of culture. That's just a flag for those of you who work in that space, because you don't need it for the rest of the talk. I want to end there by just trying to say, how do we get to this? I want to sit with some data. It's a little bit old now. It's a piece of work done with third-year chemistry students here at UCT now quite a few years ago. So I finished that analysis, but then such rich interview data, I went back to it for this little bit of exploratory analysis. And I took out of a group of 35 students in the program. I took 10 students in that group who are coming through aspects. I've done a few analyses to specifically look at their journeys, which is really interesting stuff. And I mean, it all comes through interviews on the experience of learning the course. Crucially, and I can't tell you too much about the course now because time is so short, but it was not, I did not in the interviews sit down and say, tell me about Professor X, tell me about the teaching you referred to. I said, how's the course for you? In the analysis, I took out the statements that the students make about the teaching. But essentially, they're spontaneous statements around the teaching. And they really interest me, great, for what they say about the relationship between teaching and learning. So I'm going to give you 3 slides just with quotes. I'm not really giving you the full analysis, but I think the quotes give you a flavor. Here we are. I'll just read these through. The prof explains so much that I tend to visualize. It really helps us I can see what he's talking about. Okay, we know this stuff, the stuff with good explanations. Explains everything in detail compared to some other prof who's a bit vague. Any question you ask him, he will answer it. I think that's very good. Some of the lecturers that don't ask questions. So here's 2 pieces, and I know you're thinking, yes, this is important. Providing explanations, responding to questions. Another comment about Professor's teaching. The prof himself, he gets us involved in class. I mean, I always study myself. But his method of teaching doesn't just take everything in the textbook. You need to be involved in the class. You need to concentrate more on me. If you come to class and don't concentrate, it's like sort of not coming at all. So I try to come to class each time and try to, concentrate. Ask questions. He says, solve this. And then he goes around. This is the type of thing I come to class with. The photos of real chemistry students are not the ones in the States. In case you're worried about the ethics. Yeah. So really closing off then. The last one is this comment now. So what did we hear? We heard giving explanations, answering questions. We heard about a way of using the classroom environment to put students on their toes. Some people might call that active learning. I think it's particular pedagogy. The students are asked, how did the course work for you? What made it possible to succeed? The other students in the easy access to the prof, look at my learning the course. Because I mean, the prof itself is part of the motivation that I do extra work late. I mean, on my own. Now I think we get into it, and I think this is something I hesitate to say, we're not going to easily get you through survey questions. You feel the essence of there's an interaction. So something the prof was doing in his teaching was making things different for me in my learning. In conclusion then, and I would really welcome your comments because I'm still grappling with how to characterize myself. There's no question this is technical knowledge. So some of the problems with contemporary ways of thinking of student-centered learning, it's all about happy students that are busy or whatever. This is about knowledge, and this, by the way, this course was third-year Cambridge for students. And everything was about getting your head around this very difficult material. But when we get to that nature of that interaction, there's something in what the prof is doing, I'm calling him the prof just as a pseudonym, actions and things that were expressed that made it very clear to students that they knew he expected them to master the material, to master the course, to learn. But what he was doing expressed that. I think we have a lot of work to go to actually get closer to what this is. But maybe there's something I've missed and you're going to point to the great literature. So thanks very much.
By the schedule, or by the plan, we have 5 minutes for questions. As far as the venue is concerned, we have longer than that because there's an empty slot after this. But let's stick to 5 minutes, and then if people want to chat later, they can do so. So, Charlie, and then you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think that's a very interesting topic. And I think and I want to make 2 comments. I think the first is the metaphors one uses for these things are important. If one put the word perpetrator and victim there, then there's a bit different, and I think, one can argue that there are aspects of that. But I think that for me is
in teacher and learner.
I mean, you simply perpetrator and victim and see how far you run with that. If you don't, then what emerges is not the same as some other metaphor at the other extreme end of that we also have 2 words that relate to each other, but not in that particular way. Now, I think that for me, if one goes back in history, the issue of teaching and learning doesn't seem to be such a big deal because the apprentice model, the mentoring aspect, is all about behavior. And I think it's no accident that the rise of higher education studies came about in the UK with a massification. Right? In trying to capture in a mass-based way what automatically falls out of an apprentice model, the question is that possible? And in our extreme case, the answer at this point is no.
Yes and no.
I say
We must go further. I hear you now. All right.
Thanks, Jenny, for polarizing these 2 ideas. It's remarkable to me how much difficulty we have in describing something, a whole. We still describe it as these 2 parts, but we mean the whole. We mean, to use your analogy, we mean the marriage, but we describe it in terms of the 2 parts. And I would wonder if your data could include the data from educators, from teachers, because we've all had the experience where a moment of that congruence happens, rather like the flashes that Ali was talking about. It's not a constant thing, it happens every now and then, and you know when it happens. I can tell you in this particular situation, there was a moment, or maybe it was 10 minutes, maybe it was 1 minute, but something different happened that is more aligned to this idea of the whole, rather than the sum of the parts, rather than just the one. Difficult to describe.
One last question.
Tracy, the idea of independent learners, sort of, that's something we're all sort of striving for our students to become more independent learners. One of the ideas that I'm grappling with at the moment is that when our students start taking those very hesitant steps into learning independently, which they battle with, these mind do horrifically, and then they come back to us, to the teaching and learning space, how do we sort of, in that going forward and coming back interaction, sort of try to get them to tease out the little bits that they got over there, so that when they go back, that they don't just go, I can't learn on my own, I have to come back to a teaching space, that I can successfully move into becoming a more independent learner. So it's a horribly loaded question, and thoughts on that. How do we begin to manage that?
No, that's it.
We'll basically highlight that if you want.
Oh, we highlight. All right, come and harangue me at tea.
Email or something. Really like to continue the conversation. And maybe, Ruben, I like what you ended on, because, and maybe to link back to Charlie, to art of university education. So this distinct space, and I think and I'm with Charlie, it's a different time. I mean, massified, I think the religious system comes through that shift, even in the UK, a shift that happened in the 50s and 60s. In South Africa, we haven't come to terms. Let's just not clear, but we're not massified. We are unmassified with regard to the majority population completely. Maybe just to close, I like what you suggested, because with regard to higher education, there is that building of an extraordinary independence. We produce it, a graduate, who then goes out into the world, does things beyond what we can imagine. I think there's a dynamic tension. Okay, I'm just saying I think now, so I won't give you research. Teaching is a space which is both enormously challenging and it's safe. And managing the balance between hardship. I want to refer to Ian Garber's talk on laughter. Shared some of his research on last week on laughter. The student said to him, being a UCT is like having an arrow in my leg. It's painful and it demands attention. Deal with the arrow. That bit is, and I'm not interested in higher education that doesn't have that intensity to it. But then what is that space where you are demonstrating to students, I'm here for your learning? And then in the context of diversity and inequity of where we come from as well. It's work in progress.